From Britain to Brazil, Italy to India and Austria to Australia, more than 40 countries line up behind a China-led investment bank. But who's opting out and why? The economics and the politics. This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Martine Dennis. Now, the headlines are as much about who's not joining as those who are. The list is growing ever longer of countries eager to sign up to a new China-led investment bank. Now, China set Tuesday as the deadline for countries wishing to become a founding member of what's being called the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which has prompted a rush of nations to apply. Now, these are the countries that are now approved members. They include India, Pakistan, Indonesia and the United Kingdom. These nations have applied. Among them are France, Germany, Russia and Brazil. But there are two notable exceptions, the United States and Japan, for now at least. Well, both of those countries, of course, have a huge stake in the existing institutions, namely the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund and the Asian Development Bank, the ADB. And we can get some perspective now. China commands less than 6.5% of the vote in the Asian Development Bank, a little over 5% in the World Bank, and less than 4% in the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF. Good reason then to create its own alternative, or is this part of a bigger plan to challenge the world economic order? Al Jazeera correspondents have been gauging reaction to this new bank, starting with Adrian Brown in Beijing.
Well, few countries could manage what Beijing is proposing right now. In essence, it's seeking to challenge Washington's dominance of two of the world's biggest financial institutions, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. For too long, Beijing says Washington's voice has prevailed here and that the institutions need reform and no longer reflect the changing shape of the global economy, an economy that's increasingly dominated by China. So with the bank that China's proposing to set up, it hopes to change all of that. China, of course, also believes this bank will dovetail neatly with another project it's been touting, the revival of the Silk Road trade route between China and Europe. That will involve billions of dollars of new infrastructure, which it hopes will be paid for by loans from its new bank.
Here at World Bank headquarters, the Chinese initiative is not being seen, at least officially, as a competitive threat. The American president of the bank says it's already in deep discussions about cooperating on infrastructure projects. And another major institution, the IMF, is also sounding positive about the new lending group.
I think that the manier, sometimes the better. And there is plenty of work to be done. Infrastructure needs is not in short supply.
U.S. officials also say they're willing to look at co-financing some projects with a Chinese-led bank so long as they comply with high standards of transparency and concern for the environment. And many here believe that the Chinese would not have been driven to set up this new bank if the U.S. Congress had agreed to increase China's voting share in the IMF.
If it's up to Indonesia, the headquarters of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank should be based right here in Jakarta. Indonesia says it's a logical choice because the country will be one of its biggest clients. Indonesia wants to invest $438 billion in infrastructure in the next 5 years. It wants to build 5,000 kilometers of railroad, 2,600 kilometers of road, 24 seaports and 48 dams. Most of the money will have to come from foreign investment. Indonesia is not only lobbying very hard to host the bank, but it's also eyeing one of its most powerful positions, the vice presidency. But many are questioning Indonesia's chances due to a lack of proper infrastructure and space right here in Jakarta to host such a prestigious international institution.
OK, let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Beijing is Xiaoyang, who's a scholar at the Carnegie-Tsinghua Centre for Global Policy, who focuses on China's international relations. In Davis, California, we have Wing Woo, who is president of the Jeffrey Cheah Institute on Southeast Asia, a Malaysian think tank. And in London, we have Richard Wellings, the deputy editorial director of the Institute for Economic Affairs. Welcome to you all, gentlemen. Can I start with you, Richard, by asking why so many Western countries, particularly countries like the United Kingdom and New Zealand, who were very quick off the block, why do they all want to join this Asian infrastructure bank, which is something that is causing quite a stir?
Well, I think this reflects economic reality, that the core of the global economy is shifting eastwards towards China. And of course, it's also due to economic self-interest, wanting to get a slice of some of these potentially very lucrative contracts that could come out with some of these infrastructure investments. So it's about making bridges with China, hedging their bets in terms of reducing their dependence on the US and starting to face eastwards rather than westwards.
Even with the incumbent danger of offending the United States, because the Americans were not particularly happy, certainly with Britain, were they, in the first instance?
No, and of course they've tried to stop some of the other countries joining, Australia and South Korea. They've put real pressure on not to join, which apparently doesn't seem to have worked. But nonetheless, it's not the end of the world for America. If this creates more growth, it's good for America too. So I don't think they're going to press too hard on this.
Xiaoyang in Beijing, why is China doing this? Is this about the recalibration of world economic power? And this is China, the world's second largest economic power, wanting an international financial institution of its own.
I don't think it's really a new system. So it's true that as China grows, China wants to get more voice in the global financial system and also in the political arena. However, this bank, they will follow World Bank standard. And I think it's just because China is disappointed by the delayed IMF reform. Therefore, they want to have a new bank, but with the old standard.
And coming to you, Wing Woo, in Davis, California, what particularly does Malaysia stand to gain from an Asian infrastructure investment bank?
Well, Malaysia clearly needs quite a bit of infrastructure. Like, for example, a high-speed train between Singapore and Kuala Lumpur, and then later to Penang, which is in the north. And besides that, there will be road projects and irrigation projects. And right now, if you look at Malaysia, it is a middle-income country that's no longer eligible for loans from the Asian Development Bank at concessionary loans rates.
And so Malaysia then stands to get access to funding that other international financial institutions have shut it out of. Not
at the same rates that they were able to get from China, and at the same time, Malaysia now suffers from a shortage of private investment due to, well, the simple word is bad economic policies in the country right now. So this infusion of infrastructure spending would not only boost up the economy, it would also enlarge the capacity of the country to produce. So yes, this is a very timely boost to the economic potential of Malaysia.
And Richard, we've heard from Tang in Beijing that this prospective bank is going to be governed along strict lines that would apply to any other financial institution. But there are concerns about it. The United States has been expressing time and again reservations about the kinds of articles under which this bank would operate.
Yes, that's right. And of course, that's partly because of bitter experience with the World Bank, which in its early decades saw a huge amount of corruption, massive human rights abuses with some of these projects, destroying indigenous villages and rolling over human rights and so on. massive losses due to corruption that could run into the tens of billions of dollars, according to some estimates. So clearly there are concerns that perhaps the standards could be a bit sort of more loose with this new bank than they are with the World Bank, which has had to tighten up its own criteria. So I think those concerns are justified. And also, obviously, a lot of infrastructure investment isn't well conceived. It's often very wasteful, and a lot of these projects don't make great economic returns and often end up with massive operating subsidies in the long term that actually damage the recipient economy. So there are lots of these economic considerations.
And Tang, in Beijing, this is clearly something that the Chinese authorities have taken into consideration. But are they prepared to make an explicit commitment to follow the existing conventions with regard to respect for human rights, with respect to the environment, for instance, in terms of the way this investment bank is going to work?
I think in general, Chinese government, they have already stated that they will follow the World Bank standard. However, I think in some concrete cases, there are often different opinions. For example, when China, they say environmental standard, this may be a little different from what the US or UK thinks. So I believe there will be some discussion on what is the appropriate or the fitting standard for some concrete cases. However, this bank provides a platform in which China has enough power to express its own standard and its own view of environment and social rights.
And Richard, in London, it seems very much as though this has come about, the whole notion has come about as a consequence of a mistake, perhaps, or a series of mistakes emanating from the existing financial institutions for failing to reward, if you like, the emerging economies, in particular China, for plying in more cash when it was desperately needed in the 2008 financial crisis. They didn't reward China with more say, more control in those institutions.
That's correct. I mean, this represents long-term frustration, not just from China, but also amongst a lot of the other emerging economies, that the World Bank, IMF, and all these various international institutions are too dominated by the US and the US allies in Western Europe. And you see that still with the voting rights and so on. And in a sense, the World Bank and the IMF act as an arm of US foreign policy and produce or use to extend US geopolitical power. And that causes immense frustration among some of these emerging economies who'd like to have a much greater say and also get some of the benefits from influence in some of the rapidly growing developing economies. So in a sense, this is a sign of a big geopolitical shift, and we can expect this to be extended further, perhaps with other kinds of institutions being growing up based around China.
And Wing Woo, then if the Malaysian government feels that now it will have greater access to a greater amount of financial resources to carry out the much of the infrastructure projects that it has in mind, is it going to be concerned in the least about the terms, about the conditions? Because of course these are criticisms that have long plagued the World Bank in the past, of the terms and conditions that were attached to any loan. Is this something that is concerning the Malaysians with regard to this new bank?
Well, one thing for sure is that to think of the World Bank as being an institution that has been observing, prioritized environmental protection and human rights goes right against the history of the World Bank. After all, if you look at among the biggest borrowers of the World Bank in the past was Suharto's Indonesia. There was Mobutu's Congo. Basically, the World Bank has always been a weapon of the Cold War. And the question is, why should China want to waste money? Clearly, the Chinese would invest in projects that are economically viable as much as possible. And they would, of course, do that consistent with their goals of ensuring in line with their national security considerations. Like, for example, look at the founding members that have signed up to be members of AIIB. You have countries that are involved in the South China Sea dispute. You have the Philippines signing on as a founding member, and Vietnam has chosen not to sign on as a founding member. So you could see what has happened is that this has also been a useful strategic weapon to split the opposition to Chinese concerns about its access to the South China Sea.
And Tang, in Beijing, as the IMF and the World Bank have long been accused of being an extension of US foreign policy, could not this new bank merely be a tool by which to dispense Chinese economic largesse and obviously secure Chinese influence? Is that it could be seen merely as a vehicle for furthering Chinese interests, couldn't it?
Certainly. I believe this will be seen, and Chinese bank, they themselves also admit that to some point. And that's actually, frankly, the Bretton Woods system that carries out US interest, and Asian Development Bank has more Japanese interests. That's open, something open for the public. However, I think the Bretton Woods system and the Asian Development Bank and this AIIB, they meanwhile try to strive to be an international platform and to give money to the poor country for the development. So it's just from different people, but to do something which has a public interest. And although we say if they doing this, they may get some fame and get some benefit or get more respect. This we understand, but we still think this is something worth doing, and it's not really self-interest, but it's the mixed interest.
Tang, can I ask you about Taiwan? Taiwan, I understand, has applied to join. How will its application be viewed by the Chinese authorities?
I think the Chinese authority has already expressed welcome to Taiwan's participation. And actually, Hong Kong also has submitted application. So now the problem is the name of Taiwan in the bank, because of course Taiwan is officially considered as a part of China. So will Taiwan use a name which reflects this official status, or will they use another name to reflect their status of self-governing island? So this actually will be the main problem.
And Richard, in London, it seems to me that increasingly what we're witnessing is a shift in geopolitical influence, a shift in the time significantly. It seems as though the international financial institutions set up by Bretton Woods have not kept a pace with these shifting times.
Yes, that's right. So we see a rapid relative decline in the share of the global economy made up of Western Europe and the United States. But as you say, the international institutions haven't really reflected that. We saw China overtake the United States as the world's largest economy properly measured last year. And in a sense, these global economic tides are all pointing in the same direction, that the US is in relative decline. It's increasingly peripheralized. It's got long-term structural economic problems with an aging population, massive debts, and pretty mediocre human capital. So we can expect, as long as Eastern countries continue fairly sensible economic policies, for them to become the new global core. And increasingly Western Europe will look to sort of look eastwards and become part of that core rather than continuing with its Atlanticist emphasis as it has at the moment.
And Wing Woo in California, just having access to a greater pot of investment cash for the Malaysian government is not necessarily going to ensure better economic policy, is it?
One thing for sure, this investment is good for the country. How could it be bad for a country to build a better educational system, infrastructure for education, build better roads?
But the existing institutions, have not been terribly impressed, have they, with the economic management of the Malaysian government, which is why they haven't been so forthcoming in offering the investment funds that Malaysia requires.
Malaysia is already a middle-income country, so it has graduated away from the low-cost loans that it used to get. And furthermore, if you look at the rising needs of Asia, there is simply not enough to give to Malaysia the proportion it used to receive. The way that whole discussion that essentially framed is that it is bad for the country. Somehow it will bankroll bad policies. That simply need not be the case at all. In other words, what the Chinese tends to give their money to is for very specific hardware. And these are hardware that will enlarge the productive capacity of these countries. And more importantly, these countries, by joining AIIB, is helping to allow China to emerge to become a responsible stakeholder. These countries do not want to be seen as blindly on the side of the United States when the United States has what the United States is doing in the Middle East is not winning much kudos in Malaysia and in Indonesia.
And Tang, in Beijing, China obviously will retain a controlling interest in the bank. How will it choose the kinds of projects? What kind of oversight will it employ? Because, of course, in the past, many Chinese infrastructure projects have been criticised for being carried out shabbily, for not really investing in the local communities in which the infrastructure project is being carried out, for instance.
I think the name of the bank already indicates that the Chinese China thinks infrastructure is the key to the development of Asian region and also to the developing countries. So this infrastructure, including roads, dams, and power plants, and telecom project, etc. And I think China just sees that the World Bank and IMF for the last 20 years during the structural adjustment period, they lag behind in infrastructure investment. Therefore, the AIIB will make this, will try to compensate this neglection and try to invest more in this big, large infrastructure projects. And it's true that for this large infrastructure projects, there may be some controversies, but actually China proved from its own experience that this kind of projects will largely accelerate the development of the poor region.
And Richard, in London, whatever happened to the BRICS Bank? It wasn't that long ago that the BRICS countries emerged as a new bloc, as a power on the economic stage, and we were hearing of a BRICS Bank. Has China turned its back on that as an idea and instead is focusing on what will essentially be its own? I have to ask you to be brief, I'm afraid, Richard.
Well, I think the BRICS Bank is different in a sense because that has a global reach, whereas this new AIIB is focused on infrastructure in Asia. So I think possibly the two could be symbiotic and help one another and possibly do different kinds of projects. So they're not necessarily in conflict, I don't think. OK,
Richard Wellings in London, Wing Woo in Davis, California, and Tang Xiaoyang in Beijing. Thank you all very much indeed for talking to us here on Inside Story. Thank you. And as ever, thank you for joining us. If you've got anything you'd like to add, any questions or any comments, you can always go to our programme page at aljazeera.com. You can post your comments on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or there's always the Twitter sphere. You can go to @AJ Inside Story. I'm Martine Dennis, and from the whole team here in Doha, it's bye for now.